Welcome to the Distinctive Dermatologist, the podcast for professionals in dermatology. Our goal is to help your practice stand out and deliver the ultimate experience for your patients, so they schedule repeat visits and refer your practice to their friends. We're here to help your practice become more profitable. Here's your host, 7-time best-selling author, in-residence faculty member at High Point University, Hall of Fame professional speaker, and member of the Sales and Marketing Hall of Fame, Scott McKain.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Distinctive Dermatologist. I'm Scott McKain, and as always, the Distinctive Dermatologist is brought to you by GentleCure from SkinCure Oncology. GentleCure, tough on cancer, easy on skin. You know, when we talk about creating a distinctive patient experience, we often focus on how patients are treated. Were they greeted warmly? Did the staff communicate clearly? Was the appointment on time? Did the physician listen? And all those things matter. But there's another part of the patient experience that may matter even more. Did the patient have a voice in what happened to them? There's an important difference between informing a patient about a treatment and involving a patient in choosing their treatment. And that difference is what's the heart of this week's episode, because patients today have access to more information than ever before. They research the diagnosis, they search for treatment alternatives, they read reviews, they talk with friends and family, and increasingly they arrive at your office not simply wanting to be told what will happen next. They want to understand their options. They want you to take their questions seriously. And when clinically appropriate alternatives exist, they want a meaningful voice in deciding which approach is right for them. That simply isn't a clinical issue, it's a patient experience issue. And as we'll hear throughout this episode, it can also become a significant business issue for your practice. Because when patients believe that they've been heard, and when they understand their options to participate in decisions about their own care, they can leave with something more than the successful treatment of a medical condition. They can leave with greater confidence in their dermatologist and the practice. And confidence becomes satisfaction, satisfaction becomes loyalty, and loyalty can become advocacy and referrals. So today we're going to look at the patient experience from several different perspectives, but they all lead us back to one central idea. A distinctive patient experience gives the patient more than care. It gives the patient a voice. And there's no better place to begin that than with an actual patient. Mike has been diagnosed several times with skin cancer. As you listen to his experience, I want you to pay attention to something beyond the details of his treatment. Listen to what mattered to him as a patient. Listen to what he wanted to understand. And most importantly, listen to the role that having choices played in his perception of the care he received.
Quite frankly, I felt like I was spending way too much time at the dermatologist in that regard, and not getting the care that I wanted and needed. And that return visit, like, okay, yeah, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. We're going to do a biopsy. We're going to have you come back. We'll do this. And I like one-stop shopping. If I'm there, you see something, let's biopsy it right then and there. Let's get this thing done. My time is just as valuable as anybody else's. And so I try to keep that in, with my visits to the dermatology. So those were the turnoffs at the beginning, was spending way too much time, and there was really no personal connection. Mm-hmm. It was like I was just a number at this place. It was too big. So I found a local gal who ran her own business. And I feel like a lot of the PAs are up to speed on a lot of the newer stuff that comes out, but the dermatologist, some may be up there in years like myself now, and don't take advantage of going out and going to the seminars and catching up on the latest. Yeah. So fortunately for me, when I'm back and forth and down in Boston, I get the latest. And I told you I was on an oral chemo I share my information with others. Like,
Mhm.
I feel that there's more than I that are in this predicament, and hence why I agreed to do this podcast today. Get the message out there, share it with others. Geez, that may benefit me. I have had, 20, 30, 40, basal cells. Maybe I should be discussing this with my dermatologist. Maybe my dermatologist doesn't know anything about this. Maybe he or she could reach out to Dana-Farber and learn a little bit more about this. So today, in that regard, I feel like I'm not only a patient, I'm an educator. Like, I literally spend 2 or 3, times a week on the phone with somebody, a friend or a friend's daughter or son, or who's just gotten diagnosed or looking for the best, or what would you do if you were in this boat type deal. So I do that quite a bit. I'm not an expert. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PA. However, I got my finger on it. I know what to look for, and I know when things are pretty serious, and when they're when you can just get some liquid nitrogen and torch yourself, as I call it.
Well, you make a great point, because in any business, in any industry, you'd better know what your customer is experiencing, right? And you have a perspective that many of the doctors don't, right? Because you've been on the side, they diagnose it and they treat it, but in many situations they haven't experienced it as you have. So you bring that unique perspective. And if you were going to advise dermatologists or practice leaders in what they could do to be more responsive to patients and deliver a better experience for patients, what are some of the things that you would suggest that they pay attention to, that they do?
Well, I do realize that, everybody's in this game to make money. I get that, and I get the fact that, like, if Mike comes to you and he's got 4 or 5 spots that need some Mohs surgery, that we don't have to do them all over a period of time. So I repetitively back and forth. We'll take care of that one this time, that one that month, this one this month, that one. I like to go in, as I say, to one-stop shopping, and 3 or 4 of them. A lot of them don't require a skin graft. I think that some do, and I'm aware of that, but not everyone does. And we can still do Mohs and not have to do the skin graft. So when you don't get to the skin graft, the time consumption of these, you could literally do 3 or 4, as I've had done several times, and been in and out within an hour and a half. That's pretty good time, considering when I first started at the dermatologist, I was spending an hour and a half just to see the dermatologist, and not knowing what's going on yet.
What strikes me about Mike's story is that what he wanted really wasn't complicated. He wanted to understand what was happening. He wanted to know all of his options, and he wanted to have a voice in the decision that was, after all, about his health and his life. And that raises an important point for every dermatology practice. Sometimes we think of the patient experience as everything surrounding the clinical encounter. The friendliness of the staff, the comfort of the office, communication, convenience, scheduling, follow-up, and those things absolutely matter. But the clinical conversation itself is also a component of the patient experience. A patient who feels welcome but not heard has not received an ultimate patient experience. A patient who experiences an efficient appointment but leaves without understanding the alternatives available hasn't received an ultimate patient experience either. That's why this next perspective is important. Laura Billet of GentleCure spends considerable time thinking about the patient experience and what patients should expect from their interaction with dermatologists. Listen to what Laura has learned about the experience from the patient side of the examination room. One of the things that's of interest to me, too, that I've seen in much limited My exposure obviously is much more limited than yours, but is the pressure on the dermatologist in terms of time? So therefore the staff becomes very important because the patient may not get that much face time with the dermatologist. So what are some of the things that you've seen in terms of how the clinic staff works with patients to, again, create the experience that the clinic wants?
I think that's fair. Some are very militant, right? Patients in, patients out. Then you have other dermatologists that want to talk to patients and they'll give patients more time, right? But then they tend to run behind. So it's like a very fine line. Something that's like, I find very important is communication, right? The ability to communicate with the practice. From experience, I just went recently and had my annual skin check, right? And I walked out with 2 prescriptions, and I get home and I get them filled, and I get home and I didn't even remember how to use them. Like, I didn't remember, right? And so being able to call the practice, get a human, right? Or be able to text the practice with technology these days and have someone answer is becoming more and more important, especially as dermatologists are stretched extremely thin with just the number of patients, the limited number of dermatologists in certain areas, to be able to see their patient load and give every patient the time and give patients time to be able to discuss everything that they need to discuss and feel comfortable leaving that practice.
Laura, of course, raises an important distinction. There's a difference between providing excellent service to a patient and creating an excellent experience for that patient. Service is what we do for someone. Experience includes how someone feels about what is happening with them. And that becomes especially important when treatment decisions are being made, because if multiple clinically appropriate options exist, then there's an obvious question. Who gets to decide which option the patient hears about? Now think about that for a moment. If patients are presented only with the treatment a particular physician or practice happens to provide, are you truly giving them a choice? Or are you giving them a recommendation without making them aware that a choice even exists? This is where patient experience, patient education, and shared decision-making intersect. Adam Lefton of GentleCure has spent considerable time talking with dermatologists and examining this issue. And with his background prior to his work in dermatology, he even formed the opinion that there's an important gap between the options that may be available to a patient and options that are actually presented. Here's Adam.
When I was with Cancer Treatment Centers of America, the number one pet peeve of mine was when somebody would call our call center to discuss treatment at Cancer Treatment Centers of America because they were leaving one of the most renowned cancer treatment institutes in the world, right? And it happened a lot, right? And what we would hear from those patients is, I was told that there was nothing more that could be done. And in reality, that's a terrible thing to say to a patient, because it's actually self-serving and not really true. What these institutions should have said is, I'm sorry, there's nothing more that we know of that can be done. But instead, when they say there's nothing more that can be done, they strip away all hope, all options, and patients pass away. And I'm not saying that at Cancer Treatment Centers of America, we saved every patient who came through our doors. Far from it. But we saved some. And for others, we extended their life with a high quality of life for months, if not years. And so that's the battle I fight every day. It's those doctors and those institutions that just feel like they've got the only answer. And if they don't have an answer, there is no answer. And in the world of skin cancer treatment, all too often, we hear doctors saying to their patients, I diagnosed you in this practice. In this practice, we do Mohs surgery. We're scheduling you for Mohs surgery, and the conversation ends there.
Thank you, Adam. So the principle we're discussing today is straightforward. Patients deserve to understand their clinically appropriate options so they can participate meaningfully in decisions about their care. And one of those options for appropriate non-melanoma skin cancer is image-guided superficial radiation therapy. And GentleCure, our sponsor, of the Distinctive Dermatologist, helps dermatology practices provide IG-SRT as a non-surgical treatment option for appropriate patients. And you're about to hear again from someone you met earlier in the episode, Mike. But this time you'll hear more about the treatment option he chose and his experience with it. Here's this week's message from our sponsor, GentleCure.
I was only 23 when I was first diagnosed with non-melanoma skin cancer. 40 years later, I've had almost 20 Mohs surgeries. I had just accepted that the pain and the scars were going to be part of my life. But when I was diagnosed with 2 basal cells on my face, I became determined to find an alternative to surgery.
If you, like millions of others, are affected by skin cancer, it's important to know that surgery isn't the only option. There's another choice. GentleCure.
It sounded like everything that I had been looking for.
GentleCure uses low-energy X-rays to kill skin cancer cells with a 99% cure rate. Plus, there's no cutting, no surgical scarring, and no downtime.
I'm so glad I did it. It was successful in every way.
To learn more, call today or go to GentleCure.com.
There's an interesting reason I wanted to close today's program with our next guest. Kerwin Brandt is the CEO and co-founder of SkinCure Oncology, the company behind GentleCure. But the story behind the company didn't begin simply with a business plan or an analysis of market opportunity. It comes from a patient experience, and I think that matters because it illustrates something that extends well beyond dermatology. Some of the most important innovations in business occur when somebody pays close attention to the customer, or in this case, the patient, to recognize that what people want and what an industry traditionally provides aren't always the same thing. There's also another side to Kerwin's story that I believe is particularly relevant for dermatologists. Sometimes we assume that providing patients with more choices somehow works against the interests of the practice. But what if the opposite is true? What if patients who feel heard become happier patients? What if patients who participate in their treatment decisions become more satisfied with their experience? And what happens when those patients start telling other people about the dermatologist who listened to them? That's where patient experience stops being merely a philosophy about how patients ought to be treated, and it becomes a practice growth strategy. Here's Kerwin Brandt.
And my peers, all about my age, they didn't think it was such a great idea initially, but thankfully I had a board member who was with us who had had about 8 Mohs surgeries before, and he said, listen, guys, he asked how many of us had ever had Mohs surgery before, and clearly none of us had. And he said, well, let me tell you, as somebody who's had 8 Mohs surgery, if there's an option that's anywhere close to the efficacy of Mohs surgery, and you offer it, and it's a non-surgical solution, it'll be a shining success. And again, a little point of divine intervention, the fact that he was there, and we were able to get the company launched, and the rest is really history. It's really gone consistently up and to the right. Just more and more patients that have been treated. Today is incredibly fulfilling being here with a 100,000 patient. Really great story of a patient who was treated in Chicagoland and relocated into the Scottsdale area. And the first thing that she did was she looked up a dermatologist that also offered GentleCure, and that was a prerequisite for her in selecting a dermatologist because she had been treated before. And as she expected, she had another lesion that maybe even a couple of lesions that appeared, and she went again and once again had another round of GentleCure to cure these additional lesions that were in totally different areas of her face. And she, just to listen to the gratitude from a patient who is so thankful that she, doesn't today bear scars from the treatment of her non-melanoma skin cancer is incredibly gratifying.
There's a line from Kerwin's comments that I hope stays with you, because the lesson from this entire episode isn't that every patient should receive a particular treatment. In fact, it's almost precisely the opposite. The lesson is that every patient deserves the opportunity to understand the clinically appropriate choices available to them. Now, Mike showed what that looks like from the patient's perspective. Laura reminded us that the treatment conversation itself is an essential part of the patient experience. Adam challenged us to consider what happens when physicians present only the treatment modality they personally provide. And Kerwin showed us something else. Listening to what patients want isn't just good for the patients, it can be very good for the practice. That's because there's an important progression at work. When patients understand their choices, they become more engaged. When they feel heard, they develop greater confidence. When they participate in decisions about their care, they can become more satisfied with the experience. Satisfied patients talk. They tell their families, they tell their friends, they leave reviews, they make referrals. In other words, giving patients a voice doesn't diminish the dermatologist's experience or their expertise. Instead, it demonstrates it. See, expertise isn't merely knowing what treatment you would choose. It's having the knowledge and confidence to help a patient understand the appropriate alternatives and then helping that patient make the decision that's right for them. That's what shared decision-making can look like at its best, and it brings us back to where we began. Patient experience isn't simply what happens around medical care. The medical care is part of the experience. The conversation is part of the experience. The explanation is part of the experience. The choices are part of the experience. And whether the patient feels that they had a voice is absolutely part of the experience. Perhaps the simplest way to put it is this: the best patient experience isn't created by deciding for the patient. It's created by caring enough to decide with the patient. That's how you create happier patients, is how you earn greater trust. And that's one more way you can create a truly distinctive dermatology practice. I'm Scott McKain. Thanks for joining me on this edition of The Distinctive Dermatologist. And my thanks as always to GentleCure for their support of this program. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening, and join us next time for The Distinctive Dermatologist with Scott McKain.